talk about fraud. But firstly, as many have previously, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the lands upon which we meet today. So in particular, I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yabara as the First Nations owners of the lands where we stand, pay respect to elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. I haven't been here all day, but it's certainly been fascinating to hear the presentations before me around COVID and around vaccinations and around some of the challenges that we face. And I'm here to talk about a different challenge that we've been facing in the world of fraud. I've been researching fraud for over a decade now. So when COVID hit, there's nothing that I haven't seen before, but it's been really interesting to see how it has transitioned, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my observations of what fraud, how it's moved and how it's permeated in these past 18 or so months. But first I want to give a definition of fraud. So at its heart, fraud is all about deception, it's about lying, it's about cheating for a financial reward. So fraud is not new, the internet didn't create it, COVID didn't create it, fraud has always existed. But I guess the ways in which it's perpetrated and the ways in which it's targeted at potential victims certainly has changed across the decades and in recent months as well. There's many different ways to perpetrate fraud, both online and offline. Again, as I just mentioned, the internet did not create fraud, but the internet has created a lot of opportunities for offenders to exponentially increase their target audience and potentially defraud individuals on a much greater level. If we look at some of the statistics about fraud in Australia, the ACCC, Australian Competition Consumer Commission, reported this year that in 2020, there was $851 million that was reported lost to fraud. Now, one of the things we know about fraud is the severe underreporting of this particular crime type. It's estimated to be one of the lowest reporting categories of crime. So there's estimates anywhere between the UN a little while ago noted that probably like 1% of cybercrime more broadly was reported. It's generally indicated that less than 30%, less than a third of all fraud is reported. So $851 million, that's a lot of money. It was up from $632 the year before. If we look at the USA, $3.3 billion was reported lost in 2020, up from 2019. Canada had $160 million. Hong Kong, $2.96 billion, which was significantly up from the year before for them. We see significant rises year upon year upon year, and I hosted an event quite recently for National Scams Awareness Week, and the Deputy Commissioner of the ACCC estimates that for 2021 we're going to see in excess of $2 billion reported loss to fraud in Australia. So COVID has been fantastic for offenders. They certainly embraced it, and I'll talk about the reasons for that. But I think just to recognise these stats are shocking and horrific in and of themselves. They don't encapsulate the non-financial harms that are incurred through fraud victimisation. They don't capture, I guess, the severity and the ongoing costs. And the government response and the way that we view fraud, in my eyes, is not commensurate with these stats and with the individual victims that sit behind these statistics. This is just to illustrate my point about this year being quite significant. So this is taken from the ACCC website. You can see the blue is the previous years, that's 2020 losses, and the green is the current losses for this year for 2021. You can see there are significant differences between the value that is being lost across this year. It's a significant increase in terms of the reports that are being received by the ACCC. So why is fraud successful? I mean, at its heart, it is a human problem. And I think that's one of the challenges because particularly, I guess, in the space that I work in around kind of cyber and cybersecurity, there is this belief that you can build an app and like an app will be the answer to everything. And technology has its role to play, but at its heart, as I said, fraud is a human problem. It's about targeting individual vulnerabilities and weaknesses at a human level in order to gain that financial reward. So offenders are highly skilled, they're tech savvy, they know exactly what to do to identify that vulnerability and to manipulate and exploit it. They can easily work in groups, and we know that there's a relationship between fraud and organised crime. I was reading an article quite recently, yesterday on the ABC website. There was an interview with an offender who kind of seen the light and was shedding some of the, I guess, information on the practices that he used to partake in. and it's very much linked to organised crime. We know that offenders bombard victims with communications across all platforms, so it's not just emails, there can be text messages, there can be phone calls, video chats, and in some cases actually face-to-face. And we know that offenders always have an answer for any kind of potential question that a victim might have. And it's always potentially plausible, and they're very good at manipulating the truth and preempting, I guess, what victims might question. One of the other challenges is that victims don't believe they're susceptible. So we have this issue in society where we don't like to think that we are vulnerable to fraud, whereas I would argue that everyone in this room, myself included, could potentially be a victim if we're targeted in the right way at the right time. That doesn't mean that the same approach would work for all of us, but it does mean that everyone has a weakness or vulnerability that could be targeted effectively. So, COVID-19. COVID-19 clearly has been a significant disruptor on a global scale. So, beginning of 2020, I was writing about fraud and bushfires, and it wasn't very long until we kind of seamlessly transitioned from bushfires here in Australia into COVID-19, kind of one disaster after another. And the offenders just kind of, they rolled on in, they rolled from their bushfire approaches through to COVID-19 and haven't stopped since then. So COVID-19, we've seen the use of lockdowns, we've seen social distancing, we've seen restrictions of movement. Particularly some of our friends and family and colleagues down in Melbourne endured the most restrictive number of lockdown days globally. I think it was kind of 250 plus days in lockdown. Same in Sydney. Here in Brisbane, we've been quite sheltered and we've been very fortunate in that way, but we still have had short lockdowns, we've still had social distancing, and we've still had restrictions. There are probably people in this room and those listening who haven't been able to see friends and family, either here within Australia or overseas. As a result, we've embraced online technologies. Today we're recording this, and before we had Zoom sessions from people who were speaking from other parts of the country and the world. So we've embraced online technology to connect with others across family, across work, and across social spheres. And in many ways, it's pushed people online in ways that they previously probably may have been reluctant, maybe been hesitant in some ways, but kind of COVID has forced people to do this. My parents would never have Zoomed before COVID-19. I would never have been able to convince them to do that, but lockdowns, grandchildren, it's amazing what they'll do. So we've had greater online exposure, we've had people with less familiarity about the technologies and around some of the, I guess, the threats and things to look out for, and we've certainly had less support available. People have been a lot, I guess, have experienced a greater degree of social isolation and loneliness in many communities, and it's had an impact. So if we think about what offenders do, they're known to tailor their approaches to current events, and particularly world events. We know that offenders like natural disasters of all sorts. So if we go back to Hurricane Katrina, a number of years ago, that was a significant event where there was quite a bit of research documenting in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there was a significant increase in the number of fraudulent approaches targeting consumers themed around Hurricane Katrina. We've seen that here in Australia with the many floods and bushfires that we've had, where offenders use those contexts in which to theme their approaches around trying to gain that financial reward. So COVID-19 has not created fraud, as I said, but it has provided a very fertile ground for COVID-19 themed approaches. And we've seen the pandemic too, it's had waves of different approaches. So if we think back to March 2020, when the world kind of started going into lockdown and there was a lot of uncertainty about what was happening and kind of what was to come, we've gone through different ways and kind of different cycles of COVID-19, and offenders have certainly embraced that. So the impact of COVID-19, I think, has really increased the anxiety and uncertainty of the population at a societal level. So there are many people who have experienced higher degrees of stress, higher degrees of depression, of loneliness, of isolation, of anxiety. And we have been living in this very uncertain world, and it's had an impact on people in many different ways. So I would argue that COVID-19 has been a significant disruptor in terms of the vulnerability profile of a great population that we live in. So this isn't to say there are some people previously that would have been vulnerable to fraud that are still vulnerable to fraud, but I think there's also a population that previously may not have been as vulnerable to particular approaches that potentially kind of have increased their vulnerability, whether that's kind of through the restrictive social distancing, physical restrictions we've had, whether it's kind of a loss of those formal and informal support networks, not being able to go to coffee with your friends every week, not being able to see family, not working face-to-face with others and having those kind of water cooler lunchtime discussions. If we look at some of the data from the ACCC for 2020, Victoria residents recorded the highest financial losses nationwide, and that was the first time that Victorians had experienced this. And it's a no surprise based on Victoria being the most locked down state in Australia during 2020. So their losses doubled in 2020 compared to 2019, and I think their circumstances significantly contributed to that. We've also seen, I guess, with unemployment there, a lot of the population has experienced significant disruptions in terms of employment with COVID. They've lost their jobs. They've been in casualised positions with a lot of precarity, underemployment. So there have been kind of these significant changes at a large scale that have significantly changed the potential, I guess, for vulnerability to fraud. So here we have some of the COVID-themed approaches. So I think back at the beginning when everything was happening, there was a lot of anxiety. We didn't really know what was happening. Phishing attempts have just soared in terms of offenders trying to target personal information from individuals and also get banking and financial information. So phishing, as you may know, is an approach that generally uses emails to try and get personal information. So it's emails that reportedly come from an authority, whether that's the Australian government, whether that's businesses such as banks or there were many at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of around Woolworths, supermarkets. They were significant. They were the essential workers all through the pandemic around our ability to go and access food. And so there were so many phishing attempts themed with banks and different government agencies and essential services and Coles and Woolworths and Australia Post. Who hasn't gone online shopping in the last 18 months and had a delivery come to them? So offenders kind of really embraced that at the beginning. We also have seen online shopping attempts soar. So right back to the beginning, think back when nobody really had worn a mask before. Masks weren't a thing here in Brisbane. Or in Australia more broadly, we kind of had never had the need to wear a mask before. And suddenly, masks were mandated. We had to wear them. There was a significant shortage at the beginning. There were problems in terms of accessing masks. Offenders loved that. So they were selling masks online that didn't exist. We saw a number of offenders advertising personal protective equipment right back at the beginning because there was that demand for it and legitimate supply could not keep up. So many of the approaches at the beginning were kind of themed around that and were successful because people were wanting to buy those products. They were wanting to protect themselves. Sanitizer. There was a period of time when nobody could buy hand sanitizer. And it would kind of go on the shelves at 9 o'clock in the morning and disappear within like 10 seconds of people fighting over it. Toilet paper. We all know toilet paper just became this kind of crazy commodity that people would literally fight over in the supermarket. Offenders embraced this. They were selling toilet paper. They were selling sanitizer. But these products didn't exist. They were just taking people's money and using it for themselves. Business email compromise has also increased, and this is not surprising given kind of that dramatic shift we had from working in offices, connected in office environments, regulated environments, to everybody working from home on their own devices, with their pets, with their children, kind of on their home Wi-Fi. Offenders loved that. They embraced that change, that disruption, because the security settings that you have on your home network may be different to your corporate network. If you receive an email from someone or from your boss asking you to do something, you're not in contact with them. You can't just kind of look over your shoulder, knock on their door, or just ask them, when you send me this email, you asked me to do this, is this true? Or do you want me to do this? There was kind of that isolation and that segregation around work environments that offenders really kind of embraced. So we've seen business email compromise, which is where an offender will take on the identity of a boss or of an organisation in order to use that kind of trust between business and employee or business and supplier in order to get that financial reward. Then we shifted in the pandemic. We shifted to a few different phases where at one point the government enabled or offered people the ability to withdraw their superannuation in 2 instalments, so up to 10,000 for 2020 and up to 10,000 for 2021. So suddenly we were seeing approaches whereby offenders were approaching individuals and asking them, kind of pretending to offer them or offering them a service in order to withdraw that money. So they were getting all of the details of individuals, of their superannuation, and they were then withdrawing it for their own benefit, not for that of the individual. Or they were charging people to do it, charging them to withdraw the money, even though the service was free. So offenders really kind of embraced all the different measures that the government put in place for their own financial reward. And then we moved to vaccination. So we've already heard about the vaccine hesitancy, but when vaccination started, again, they were short supply. It was very difficult at the beginning of this year. It was about February when vaccinations started being rolled out here in Australia. Supply and demand, again, was difficult. It certainly didn't match up at the beginning. So offenders were embracing this opportunity. They were offering vaccinations. They were selling vaccines on websites that clearly they didn't have the vaccines, they didn't exist, or they were selling kind of fake vaccines. They were creating websites where people could sign up to get kind of early access to vaccines, but they weren't legitimate sites and they were harvesting everybody's personal information. There was a site in the UK, it kind of purported to be the NHS, the National Health Service, and it was just harvesting all these individuals' personal information from people thinking that they were registering in order to get the vaccination earlier than others. Also around payments, kind of upfront payments. Here in Australia and in most countries, the vaccination has been free. We haven't had to pay for it. So, but people were kind of willing to pay for it, thinking that they could get it earlier, but they weren't. They were just losing their money and they weren't getting the vaccination. And now we're kind of in the phase where vaccinations they have been mandated, and I've got my little green tick on my Check in Queensland app. But there are people from the 17th of December here in Queensland that won't be able to access services. And we've seen vaccination certificates come into play and a fraud around vaccination certificates. So we've seen individuals here in Queensland, as well as globally, who have been selling false vaccination certificates. So individuals thinking that they're going to a doctor and getting a legitimate exemption in some circumstances have been given a certificate by someone who's not a doctor and is not valid to do that. So they paid a lot of money, they don't have an exemption. We've seen quite a number of different approaches around vaccination certificates. There's talk about being able to create false vaccination certificates through the apps and things like that. So it'll be interesting just to see how that moves. And then we're certainly not through the pandemic. So I have no doubt that whatever phase we move into next, the offenders will move and they will create the approaches relevant to whatever we're going through. We're also about to enter bushfire season again, so I have no doubt that if we are subject to bushfires across this summer, that again, offenders will kind of move from COVID back to bushfires or floods and keep going. They're just, they're not picky in terms of their approaches. So these are the top 10 products that were reported in online shopping scams in 2021 by the ACCC so far. Pets have been at the top, puppy scams. So many people during the lockdown, with that loneliness and isolation, really desperately wanted a pet. So there were so many, advertisements that flooded different websites on social media offering pets for sale that didn't exist. So many people forked out hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for animals that never arrived, that didn't exist. There's also vehicles up there in terms of people wanting luxury vehicles or wanting kind of a change. And we see kind of all different types of objects up there. Caravans as well. I'm not sure anyone who's kind of caravanning or camper vanning, but the inability to travel overseas has seen kind of an uptake here in Australia about travelling in our own backyard. It's impossible to buy a caravan or a camper van at the moment, and that's, again, is a very valuable commodity. And it's a supply and demand that offenders will seek to exploit. So as I wrap up, I think what's really important, not just in a COVID context, but just generally, is that we need, what I would argue always is that we need to normalise the conversation around fraud. We need to start talking about it in a non-judgmental, kind of neutral way in all of our conversations with our family and friends and our colleagues. We need to recognise the reality of fraud victimisation is very different to some of the assumptions that we have around who is a victim, who is vulnerable, and whether or not it could happen to me. We need to acknowledge fraud victimisation with those around us. And that's not to scare everybody into thinking that everyone will become a victim. But I think one of the challenges that is faced by victims is that when something happens, they're not sure who to talk to, or when they do experience fraud, there's so much shame and stigma associated with the victimisation that they fail to reach out to their family, they fail to engage with their friends or talk to others about what's happened. It kind of perpetuates this cycle of isolation and silence, and it gives the power to the offender as opposed to the victim. We need to accept that technical expertise and knowledge is important, but it will not always be successful against protecting against fraud. That it is this human problem that I mentioned at the beginning. And we just need to try and talk openly and constructively with our family and friends and with others about fraud. So if anything, I would just implore you to go home and have conversations with those around you about perhaps some of the COVID-themed fraud approaches that I've mentioned today. I got one of those fraudulent phone calls just as I was waiting to present today. I was presenting in a National Scams Awareness Week and my phone went off right in front of me. We're being targeted at levels that we haven't been before, and we need to be vigilant. We need to be talking about this openly with others, and we need to be able to know that if we're unsure about something, that there's someone we can talk to confirm whether or not we should or shouldn't do it. And because I'm paranoid in the work that I do, I always say don't do it. So that's it. Thank you very much.